Hello and welcome to Authors Die Twice, a podcast on video games and aesthetic theory hosted by two living failures. This week we break from our normal format of discussing a game or a series to talk about Jonathan Boulter's 2015 book, Parables of the Posthuman: Digital Realities, Gaming, and the Player Experience, published by Wayne State University Press. This is a fantastic book that takes a philosophical approach to the video game medium, to video game experience, and particularly the relationship, the often paradoxical relationship between the game player and the digital avatar. So anyone interested in the aesthetics of games, in video game narrative, and particularly sort of video game ontology or philosophy should absolutely check out this book. It's really well worth reading. Bryan and I talk about that relationship, avatar-player relationship, as well as other topics centered on the category, the conceptual philosophical category of the posthuman or of posthumanism. We also talk a bit about the shadow category that I propose, known as the prehuman, as it were. So we hope you enjoy the conversation. I'll just start by launching us right into our topic. Today we're talking about Jonathan Boulter's 2015 book, a book on video games called Parables of the Posthuman, Digital Realities, Gaming, and the Player Experience. So we both know Jonathan to some degree. You know him, I think, better than I do. But we are, I think you're actually familiar with his work outside of the game space, his work on modernist literature, on aesthetic theory, on Samuel Beckett. This is my first time actually reading his work, so I was really taken with it and thought it would be just a good topic for us to cover. I guess I already asked you this before, but do you want to say a little bit about how you got to know Jonathan?
Yeah, so back in it was either 2020 or 2021. Really the way I got to know him and his work is that I reviewed a book that he wrote about Samuel Beckett's short fiction specifically and the idea of the post-human subject. And I think in that book he makes I think some similar gestures and actually uses some of the same uh, theoretical interlocutors like Blanchot, Deleuze, and a few others uh, to make the case that Beckett's short fiction can be read along the lines of this idea of the post-human. And the post-human, in a very broad sense, is obviously, this idea of what is after the human, but it's also not. I think what I'm starting to try to understand a little bit more is that it's not necessarily teleological or chronological, right? So it's like a different way of conceiving the human that's not necessarily in the same kind of narratives or the same frameworks that we, are so used to, even in literary studies, right? And I think that the book we're talking about today does a really, maybe even does something else with it that we don't really get to see so much in the Beckett book because the medium of games just simply has a totally different arrangement of subject and object, I guess. So one thing I'll say too quickly, just as a general comment, is that something I like and maybe identify with a little bit about Boulter's style is this kind of iterative, maybe repetitive, but in a really interesting way. This iterative way of returning to his core points, which I think we can maybe talk about a little bit with these games. He does the same thing in his other work that I've read as well. I've also read his great book on the idea of Blanchot's disaster. So he has a book that was maybe 2023 came out, I want to say, from Edinburgh University Press about ecology and the disaster in Blanchot, and he reads a handful of more contemporary authors along those lines as well. So I think he has like a kind of core idea that is playing out across these games and the text that we're looking at today, and yeah, it's interesting to see how he develops that over the course of the book.
I think one of the most interesting things about this book, and the thing that makes it a really good topic for this podcast, is what Boulter is doing with the player and avatar relationship. So that's just been something we keep coming back up against. I mean, obviously, it's especially because both of us work on narrative, right, and are interested in questions of um, uh, what does it mean to take a point of view? What does it mean to have a sort of perspective or have a distance perspective on action in a story?
Right.
Or a situated perspective on action in a story. Like questions of perspective and identification are just at the forefront, are often at the forefront of our minds and thus of our conversations about video games and especially our relationships to avatars.
Mhm.
And I think both of us in different ways, I mean, also in similar ways, are uh, somewhat skeptical of I mean, it's a bit of a straw man or overstatement, but generally the truism in gaming that what makes gaming special as a medium, especially as a storytelling medium, is that you are the protagonist, right?
Yeah.
So as opposed to a novel or a film where in a film you're watching the protagonist, in a novel you're reading about the protagonist. In a game you get to be the protagonist, right? But that's actually not true. It couldn't be less true, in fact, in some sense to be a protagonist is to be more limited than you are than the protagonist is in a novel or
Yeah.
film or another medium. Um, so, I mean, one thing that is really brilliant among many things, but about this book is how rigorously Boulter analyzes that relationship.
Yeah.
Um, and he conceives of it in specific theoretical terms relating to this idea of the post-human and the post-human subject. I think we should both address that or say a little bit more, maybe explain it somewhat in a moment. But I just wanted to say right off the bat that I think what his insights about the player avatar relationship go well beyond the specific theoretical category or framework of the post-human or post-human studies. I mean, this is just a very
Yeah.
foundational, fundamental, I mean, he calls it, I think, phenomenological at one point,
Mhm.
analysis of what it means to be a player of a game and actually the complexity and paradoxicality of that relationship, rather than viewing it simply as an exercise in agency or identification.
Yeah, I mean, a few things. I think that's all really great. And this is why I think this book is so important, is because, I mean, one, for me, it's the sort of analysis I love, which is, I mean, even just your description of identification, and we are famously both skeptical of plot and identification, apparently, which maybe leaves us with the question of what there is else in narrative.
And lore.
I
We don't like
suppose.
lore
And
either.
lore, yeah, lore as well. No, but to be serious about it, we've said before that, or I personally at least have never really felt like I identified in this kind of and yeah, sure, maybe it's kind of a straw man, but I think that's not necessarily the case always. Never really identify with a character in a game, right? I mean, it sucks when you die in the game because you're controlling this figure who's your vehicle for progressing or even just for being, right? I think that's also part of what Boulter is always interested in, whether he's talking about literature or uh, in this case games. He's talking about being and existing and experiencing rather than necessarily achieving things or, progressing, which I think is maybe worth thinking about as well in the game, specifically with games. Um, but I think part of what I'm hearing too from, or what I'm realizing from what you were saying is that people also do have the same tendency with literature, with film, with television, right? I mean, we could say we have a favorite character, but a lot of people do, I think, take that to mean that they identify with a character, right? And what that identification looks like is, of course, going to be different across mediums and different simply for different people. I think what asking this question about games does is not just highlight the fact that it's um, something that means something more, I guess, in games because you are literally controlling the character. But it also just points out how games can bring this question to the forefront and allow us to critique this question a little bit more as well,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I think one way to conceptualize the issue, I'm sorry to say actually, and sorry, John, if you're listening, but I feel like this is in the book and I'm just forgetting where, but I might state the paradox of identification that's treated here thus. It's something like the more fully realized the character is, the more complicated actually the act of identification becomes, which is somewhat contrary to how we often think of identification in novels, for instance,
Right.
that a kind of psychological complexity is thought to aid identification with the protagonist. And yet, I mean, there's one really wonderful moment in this book when Boulter is discussing the Metal Gear series, particularly I think Metal Gear Solid 4, Guns of the Patriots, which I just finished. I think I mentioned that in the last pod. Um, and he notes that actually I'm gonna bring the quote up here because I don't want to every part of it is valuable and I don't want to miss anything. He writes. This may sound like a contradiction, that sympathy with a character distances me from the game. But in the case of the gaming character, this sympathy, which convinces me, he's writing of Solid Snake, which convinces me of Snake having achieved something like an interior life, that he is human enough to have and evoke emotional responses, is uncanny enough to provoke critical, thus distancing effects.
Mhm.
So what Boulter is saying is this moment in Metal Gear Solid 4 when I'm not going to spoil it because it's a key narrative moment, but when he describes having this sudden sort of perception or awareness of Snake, the protagonist of the series, as like something like a real person or as a fully realized person, is a moment both of identification and uncanny disidentification.
Mhm.
And I would sort of state the issue as this is a simplified version, maybe a cruder version, but it's precisely when we realize that Snake is his own person, right? That Snake has his own inner life, that we also realize that we're not Snake, you know?
Right.
Because the more realized and fleshed out and, as it were, human the character is, the less we can justify the strange fantasy of psychic projection or, you know, mind control that has enabled us to actually manipulate the avatar on the screen and play the game. So to flash back to, I think maybe our first full episode, I think I mentioned um, Patrick Klepek's remark on a recent podcast, or recent as of a few years ago, that he thinks of Souls characters as mechs, you know, as like kind of soulless, pun not intended, automatons that he's outfitting with various parts. And it strikes me now, I mean, reading Bolter's book especially, that like that's I think I continue to agree with that way of thinking of Souls characters. I don't think of them as having any inner life or personality. I think of them precisely as a kind of a reanimated corpse, you know, with no brain.
Mhm.
Um, but what I realize now after reading Boulter's book is that it's precisely that automatism or soullessness or vacancy that allows for identification. Because then there's no dissonance or conflict between the thoughts of the player and the thoughts of the avatar. There's a kind of just neutrality, you know, or mutual uh I want to say continuity, but it's not that I think that I myself,
Mhm.
like Nathan, am in the world of Bloodborne, right? It's more just like there's no other personality that's like overriding or in tension with my own. Um, so I'm sorry, I'm going long here, but uh, this is particularly relevant, I think, because Boulter's book is about largely about video games where you play as a robot or a cyborg. So not a robot, but as a cybernetically modified individual or
Right.
human.
Yeah.
And he calls that the posthuman, you know, sort of working from a long theoretical tradition, an important theoretical tradition. But I feel like we could also call it the prehuman, you know,
Mhm.
that like what we have in an avatar, like the soulless husk of Elden Ring is something pre-human, something that's actually prior to any interiority. And
Yeah.
that's precisely again what allows some kind of identification. Um, Whereas if the avatar in Elden Ring, like were talking and had desires, right, and thoughts and opinions, it would make the basic dissonance of controlling them much more pronounced and ultimately maybe disjunctive, even if it led to emotional sort of intensity or immersion or pleasure that Boulter describes in the case of Snake. Does that make sense? I feel like I'm kind of talking in circles here, but
No, no, no. So what you just made me think of, and I have a few other thoughts too, is that if I always had to hear the sort of accent that you get in the cutscenes in Bloodborne, for instance, always from my character, it would certainly, have introduce a problem into my gameplay, right? I would maybe have to mute it or something like that, or I would have to see if I could opt out to not hear so much dialogue or whatever, right? Um, and there are several reasons for that. I mean, I think there is like the larger overarching reason that then it would therefore just mean that there is this kind of personality in the game that you are not. And I mean, I think Boulter does a good job of kind of addressing this as well. There's always difference when we're, no matter what, right? Even if I identify as like if I'm playing a game where I'm an English professor or something like that, I'm still going to have some kind of minimal degree of difference with, or from the character. Um, but the kind of like, the those guys who are running around in the first kind of stages of Bloodborne going, this town is done or whatever, right? If I imagine my character to have the same, maybe similar background or similar like identity or something like that, just it would just be, odd, right? I mean, no, everybody would have a different kind of version of that, and that's maybe the pragmatic way in which identification could be broken. But I think the other thing too is that when we have a character that's a blank slate, just like how games versus literature bring this question to the fore, when we have a character or an avatar who's a blank slate, what's brought to the fore is something else, I think, for us precisely to identify with. And it's not identity. We're not identifying with identity. When I'm playing a game or watching a movie or reading literature or listening to music or anything, what I'm identifying with is a moment, an affect, or some kind of arrangement of or within being, not a character or an avatar, right? I'm not identifying with the speaker. I'm identifying with the instance of speech or the instance of action or the instance of seeing a sunset or something like that, right? Like that's what I'm actually like drawing from and finding some connection to, I think. And so this is where, Boulter a few times brings up Blanchot's idea of subjectivity without a subject. And I think, I'm not going to go into that whole kind of question because it's a really, Blanchot is always picking apart these sort of paradoxes. And I think we can see that this is definitely an idea that Deleuze and Guattari, picked up and kind of worked with in some of their writings. But
And
uh,
this is the French philosopher Maurice Blanchot.
yeah,
We should,
yeah. So he
yeah.
writes this in The Writing of the Disaster, which I can't remember exactly what year it was published. I think it was the 80s. I might be wrong. He wrote for, I don't know, 80 years base. I mean, 70 something years. He lived until he was in his late 90s, so he has a huge body of thought. Um, but this idea of subjectivity without a subject, right? I mean, this has to do with the avatar in the way that Boulter is talking about it. On the one hand, right, we can swap avatars, and so as a player, I have this kind of access to maybe a subjectivity without a fixed subject, and I think that's kind of what he means by posthuman. It's a different way of conceiving of the self. It's a different way that doesn't uh, always have to be instantiated within a particular identity or person or me or whatever. When I'm playing, just in the very, again, phenomenological fact of playing a game, I have access to, sure, I have access to a different identity. I could have a female character, I could have any kind of character at all, right? So there's that, right? And even, to take that a little bit further, in Elden Ring, for example, I could respec, I could swap my physical or identity attributes. But I think more interestingly, what that subjectivity without a subject is doing is pointing out that question that I kind of just highlighted, right? Uh, it's something we do already when we're engaged in this kind of play. So it articulates I think, why we're kind of sort of against or skeptical of identification in games, because again, to say that I identify with this or that character is, I mean, I think this would have to once again be a whole other episode, but it is like a huge question or a huge problem, right? Because a character, you know, if it's a novel, it has a character arc, but if it's a game, it has certain limitations um, that are maybe physical, but also affective and also, knowledge limitations, but what we're identifying with is something that's not again is not a subject. It's subjectivity. It's this kind of again like a moment or an affect. That's at least how I kind of come away from this book understanding it.
Yeah, I love that idea that what we identify with when we say we're identifying with the avatar in a game is not subjectivity, i.e., consciousness, right? Or even perspective, it's something else. And you describe that as affective or atmospheric. You could also just describe it as bodily. Like to say I identify with my bloodborne avatar is just to say that I identify with their body. It's such that their pain is my pain to some degree, and that they need to dodge the attack, otherwise they're going to suffer damage. And that's like we become synced on the level of pure sort of physical reflex. And so that's the case in all games, you could say. So part of what is greasing the wheels of identification, not to fix metaphors, is actually maybe just the absence of tension. Again, the absence of otherness. The otherness not of I think Bloodborne is quite alienating and other in its own way, but the absence of an identity, right? Of another person who's fully formed and again like has their own sense of self. Um, that it strikes me that the tension there, right? When we control Joel in The Last of Us, and we are Joel, and we're shooting people as Joel, but also Joel might not agree in principle with the stuff that we're doing as him. We're mind controlling Joel's body, but we're not actually controlling Joel's mind. Very few games actually let you simulate mental identification. What they do is simulate physical identification. They simulate walking or jumping or fighting as a character. Um, so in The Last of Us, I could sadistically dismember every enemy in a location and then sort of rig their bodies with explosives and do all kinds of gross stuff that Joel, despite his sort of like um hard scrabble vibe and desperate will to survive, like he's not a sadist. He's not just going to destroy and maim people just for the fun of it, right? So that alone is just an instance of dissonance, of psychological dissonance with the character that arises as a function of the character's own, you know, uh, um, individuality, or at least the sense that they actually are a fictional being. Um, but you mentioned not just body, this what I'm construing as bodily identification, but also spatial identification might be another vector that when we identify with an avatar, we can simply identify with being in that space as them. So again, like we look out at a vista at sunset in a game and we feel wonder, like that's an experience of identification where in some sense, maybe we are a little bit. I mean, we've put some pressure on this in previous episodes, but maybe a little bit imagining or acting as if we ourselves are there. Like, and I actually think this is inarguable. Like, one of the interesting things about wonder in a game is that we do sort of gasp, like we kind of like stop and slow down, and we perform this kind of mimesis of somebody who is actually standing at the top of a mountain and looking out and sort of marveling at the scenery,
Yeah.
right? So that kind of identification also is I think that's the kind of identification that we do believe in, right? Or we don't see as inherently contradictory.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And if I could just say too, crucially, just to call back to our video or our episode about Kentucky Route Zero, I think we mentioned it there. Or maybe it was in one of the Bloodborne episodes, but it's important too that this is not something that the character is performing, right? So we are putting ourselves in the place of the character when the character is absolutely not doing what we are doing, right?
right.
Which I think is part of, I mean, this is maybe a good way to link back to this idea of the post-human, maybe, right? But anyway, that's a
Yeah.
side note.
Yeah, so can I say a little bit about the
Go ahead.
posthuman? And
Yeah, yeah,
speaking as someone who, I think I know even less than you do about the theoretical tradition of posthumanism or the tradition of literary and aesthetic art theory. I mean, my sense of it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that, and I think this is helpful for listeners too, who are
yeah.
not academics, or even if you are an academic, like me, uh, we often think of art as being about really, I mean, in the crudest or simplest sense, like what it means to be a person, what it means to be human,
Yeah.
and that the human has often been the horizon of our understanding of artistic representation and thinking as such. Um, And so, in some ways, posthumanism is an attempt to break from that human-centered approach, or at least to conceptualize what art might be or what thinking might be if we moved beyond the human as our central framework. Even think of like the word, like, the concept of the humanities, or the human arts and sciences. That part of what the posthuman is doing is simply just putting pressure on that totally accepted and taken for granted centrality of the human subject to any sort of aesthetic or philosophical activity, enterprise, or inquiry. In more specific terms, though, the post-human often is situated in a discourse of, like, I guess, cybernetics sometimes, or cyber modification. So the idea of a cyborg is really key to posthumanism.
Hmm.
Robots, but really anything that is operating beyond what we understand to be a human or the human. Um, so I want you, if you have any corrections, please jump in with them. I want to just say one quick thing though, because whereas like Boulter is using the idea of the post-human as the central framework for understanding the player-avatar relationship in a video game. And that totally makes sense because games are technological artifacts. And because, as he points out, many games feature a cybernetic or cyborg protagonist who is literally, that is to say, representationally, like within universe or within the universe of the story, post-human. Um, I again want to add like the pre-human as another possible way of conceptualizing this. And I have reasons for potentially even favoring that term. But why don't you, you look like you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say so. I would agree. I'm not a scholar of the post-human, so I don't know. This is all just purely based on essentially well, I have read some of the source. I mean, other than Blanchot and Deleuze, I've read some of the other like N. Catherine Hales and a few other people who have more specifically kind of post-humanist quote unquote style writings. So, but without being that well versed in it, my understanding and my, I think, generous understanding of it in the way that I would like to understand this concept is that yes, it oftentimes does get kind of located into this idea of cyborgs, cybernetics, robotic things, implants, they're even like kind of really literal. I did take a class in college where we had, it was like an art class that was a lot about kind of this idea. And so some of the kind of odd experiments that people would do in terms of like trying to become post-human or or transhuman or whatever, right? There are all these different ways of phrasing it. The way I would like to understand it is that it just shifts the terrain of what we look at when we think about what is human. So I don't think it explicitly needs to be this literal, oh well, post-human means you have to become a robot or whatever, because if that's the case, then I'm absolutely not interested in that, right? But I think that even a shifting of identification, like we already said, from character to affect, that could be conceived as post-human. I mean, that's why Deleuze is interesting in this regard, and this is why Blanchot has any relevance for this at all, right? Is that it's a shifting that we do uh from this kind of I don't know, identitarian maybe is a way of putting it, this kind of human as, a unified, you know, both humanity as a unified thing, but also like particular humans as these unified bodies that go out into the world and do things to something else, right? Something else is happening even when I'm sitting here and, looking at my Zoom screen or whatever. There's a bunch of other stuff going on that's not egocentric maybe or something like that. And I think that's part of the way of understanding this that's productive, especially for games, right? So I think the gesture of including all these games that are, uh, explicitly thematizing certain modification, body modifications or whatever, right? Like even in Fallout 3, which is one of the games Boulter talks about here, there are certain enhancements that you can get that allow you to do different things and other games he mentions as well the same is true, but even though he's focusing on games that are thematically relevant in that sense, I think the point is not that, right? The point is something that's actually more just like we talked about a few weeks ago with the Bloodborne, right? Like weird fiction isn't about monsters, it's about something to do with reality. So the posthuman isn't necessarily about robots, it's about some way of understanding the human, right? Some way of doing philosophy and also creating art that highlights those things that we just don't see when we see the human as a single kind of unified thing.
hmm Yeah, that's really helpful, and it makes me think of like Debbie Urbanski's book Afterworld, which
Absolutely.
we were lucky to have Debbie on to chat about that about her novel, a few months ago, and that's a really good example of posthumanism, not just because it's about a world. I mean, I would say like just to use your distinctions, like there are AI consciousnesses in that world in that story, but it's not posthuman because of the AI, in the fiction, and it's not even post-human because it's a world, right? It's about a world where humanity has gone extinct or is about to go extinct. I would say it's authentically, or what makes it most post-human is simply the fact that a lot of narration doesn't center the human. So you
Yeah.
have moments like just descriptions of a room, like where the room itself it just becomes a story for, you'll have a long passage that's an inventory of a room.
Mhm.
And in a way, maybe that, I mean, again, I'm sort of spitballing because I don't know the concept very well, but that feels, close to something like what we see in Samuel Beckett. Like Samuel Beckett has late stories that are all about there are no human figures whatsoever. It's a story about light or a story about a space,
Yep.
or not even about isn't even the right word. It's a story that takes as its founding framework, or interest, like a space or an emanation of light. And if this sounds abstract, like it is abstract, but it also is very concrete in that like we know what a space is and we know what light is. And so if you can just conceptualize art that's focused on those things and not on the human perception of light or the human perception of a space or inhabitation within a space, but just simply on like what would it mean to like think about that space without taking as the first principle the fact that a human could perceive it or live in it or experience it.
Yeah. And this is why I think it's so interesting and kind of frustrating because again, it's paradoxical is that I mean, how am I a human going to go and think about a space in a non-human centric way, right? I mean, I think this is like the task I think of this kind of thinking, of posthumanism is to actually, yeah, not get rid of the human and whatever, and also not simply just start thinking in a different way that's like less, again, less egocentric, but to actually try to think something which does not have me as the starting point, right? Or does not have even my perception sometimes as the starting point, right? I mean, um, I think, yeah, there's a rabbit hole we could go down with that, but I do think it's maybe good to maybe talk about some of the games here and some of Boulter's readings of the games, which are really compelling. Um,
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'll maybe I can lead us into some discussion of Metal Gear. I mean, another reason why we're covering this book, other than the fact that, again, it's a brilliant book that anyone interested in video games and particularly the aesthetics of video games, and the philosophy of video games should check out immediately.
yeah.
Um, is that it's one of the key texts, the key examples is Metal Gear Solid, the Metal Gear first the whole series, and then Metal Gear Solid 4. We alluded to on the past episode that we're going to be covering at least Metal Gear Solid 2 in future episodes. So this is a nice way to maybe set the table for some of the central issues of that series. But I first just wanted to just quickly maybe expand on what I meant by the prehuman, still by way of like general framing of the issues and questions. Because again, like what's one thing that's really interesting about this book is that Boulter takes, he has this term, the posthuman, which is central, and also as the book proceeds, the concept of catastrophe or disaster becomes really central as well. This is a concept that he's drawing, I think, from Maurice Blanchot. But maybe I'll start with disaster because disaster is how I'm going to get to sort of my point about the prehuman. I was at a talk like 3 years ago on post-apocalyptic video games. And as I was listening to this talk, which was quite interesting, and Fallout was like the main example, actually. Sorry, this was like post-nuclear war video games. Um, I sort of raised the question in the Q&A that like maybe, what do we make of the fact that like post-apocalyptic and particularly post-nuclear games are like in a way they're they're a very efficient use of the medium and its limitations because like a bombed out gray featureless landscape is like just simpler to render than in fully inhabited alive landscape, you know? And I've continued to think about this for a while. It's a very basic point. I'm sure Boulter's aware of it as well. Um, but you know, there's a sort of there's an added sort of spark and interest in his readings, and that very often they're literalizing on the level of the story these conceptual elements that fully transcend the literalization. So, like his claim is that catastrophe, the notion of disaster and catastrophe are essential are essential to sort of the ontology or the sort of experience of playing a video game. Um, but of course, these are games that are specifically about disaster and catastrophe, you know. And likewise, the notion of the posthuman is just a kind of paradigm for understanding games as such, but these are games that are about post-human, like literally post-human avatars. Um, and so just, again, my sort of like angle in this would be like just as with post-apocalypse or post-nuclear, like there's a kind of technological felicity, to the subject matter. Like, isn't it the case that like it's just easier or it's more convenient or again, like maybe more conducive to identification to feature characters who are cybernetic or who are cyborg or who are non-human or post-human? Partly because, on the most basic level, like it justifies certain realistic contradictions of realism that are innate to video games. So why does my protagonist in the story why are they able to die or get severely injured or have a rocket blow up in their face and keep walking, right? Well, it's because they're a cyborg. They're incredibly powerful. Or why can they jump so high, or run so fast just because they're a cyborg. Um, these are more about like world building and sort of the question of like um, whether the depicted action, can be called realistic. But then there are these more complicated conceptual things, and also questions of pure rendering and depiction. Um, so like, why is my character so blocky? Oh, they're a cyborg, right? Why do they move so stiffly? Why do they hold their hands like that? It was because they're a robot, they're a cyborg, or they're dead, like in Souls games. Actually, the cyborg and the corpse are like an interesting twin or pair in this context because the characters and you're always a corpse of a kind in a Souls game. Um, my point really is just that like it's just a fact that basic human interactions and human embodiment and the human life world are just like even today games can barely represent them. Like to represent I've talked about this with friends before, but like to represent two characters embracing, to represent like a hug, still almost like surpasses the capabilities of our most advanced technologies, and including mocap. Um, it's even harder for like characters sleeping. Like if you ever watch a character sleeping, it's such a complicated textural problem because like you need to have a bed that's actually soft, right? You need to have sheets that dynamically respond to the body. So just on the level of pure graphical, right, like engines and depiction, like the primordial like basic experience of sleeping as a human is just like still beyond the capacities of the medium. And so all of these, eating is the same thing, like rendering, like convincing eating. When Nathan Drake eats something in Uncharted, if he does, I think he does, he eats like Chinese food or something in one of the games. It's like it looks okay, but you can tell this is a simulacrum of eating. This is not like a convincing representation of eating. Um, and so these fundamental aspects of being in a body, of being in a person, of being a person, and likewise these fundamental aspects of like our life world, like walking down a crowded street, going to a convenience store or whatever, um, uh, uh, yeah, going to work even. Like these things are so demanding and so complicated that a bombed out world full of robots just makes a lot more sense. And so, again, I'm sorry, like keep going these long monologues, but like I I'm interested in like whether Boulter's readings would change or whether his theory would change if we thought of this not
Mm.
going beyond the human or surpassing the human, but actually as like not quite measuring up to the human or failing to attain any sense of recognizable humanity in the way that a novel is just able to do, if it's good, like pretty naturally, you know. And in that case, what becomes interesting is a kind of tension between representation and fact or experience. That what we're experiencing is a kind of being in the world, to use the Heideggerian term that Martin Heidegger is another key philosopher for this book. It's a very dense book. If it hasn't been, it's not already clear to our listeners. Um, that while we're experiencing the world as a kind of pre-human consciousness or something, that pre-humanity is actually represented as post-humanity.
Hmm.
So we're understood and depicted as something from the future, something incredibly advanced, jacked up with nanomachines like in Metal Gear Solid. Um, and that in a way is actually putting a veil over, or maybe like, I don't know, maybe enhancing. It's doing something that's like, that's not identical with the experience that we're actually having. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that all makes total sense. And now I'm thinking that maybe then the the post-human is then a way to get at the pre-human or to get at like the anti-human or not anti, but like the anterior to the human or something, you know? Um, because if it's true that, it's more difficult or whatever. It's so difficult to represent, visually in games and like mechanically, I guess, the things that we do as humans. It's even more so difficult, I think, to represent the invisible things that are part and parcel of humanity, right? I mean, I think that's also another thing that's like a kind of corollary of that is that, yeah, okay, on the one hand, it's hard to show a character sleeping, but it's hard to mimetically and representationally um, give the reader the sense or give the player the sense of what it's like to fall asleep and then wake up, however many hours later, and to have dreamed in the middle and to be confused about what was real and what was the dream. And, it's you can't play a game and feel like you're eating, So like again, this jams up our ability to identify, but it also points out that so much of humanity is unrepresentable. And so maybe even conceptually then the post-human is a kind of, as you said, I think like felicitous, kind of almost like lucky concept that we have that just enables us to visualize these things or to think about these things that are just totally unthinkable or unrepresentable. And I do think I mean, now I feel like I totally have a better grasp on what the post-human is, I think, because I do think that that may be the thing that it is. It's totally not, it's not like pro robots, I think. That's kind of like the bad reading of it, right? But I do think it's what it's pointing out about the human or about even the pre-human is that as human, in like common parlance, I contain all of these things which are totally pre-human,
Mm. Mhm.
pre-identity, pre-emotion. They're affect instead of emotion, right? They're unnameable feelings and motions and actions that uh that whatever we could say, I guess humanity or this idea of the human has kind of like colonized these things and given them a name, but therefore kind of limited them to a conceptual framework that I think needs to be like reinvestigated constantly. So maybe I think maybe that's kind of hopefully that's a response to what you're saying. I hope that makes sense.
Totally. Yeah, that actually is very helpful. As I learn what the posthuman is, talking to you and reading this book. Should we chat a bit about some of the readings? You mentioned the Fallout 3, the bits on Fallout 3, which is a game that I think you know a lot better than me. I played about 40 hours of Fallout 3 back in whenever it came out, 2010, 2011. Um,
2008 actually.
oh
2008
wow.
is Fallout 3, which I was really surprised to go back and look at that. And you know what? Yeah, maybe I'll talk for just a few minutes about Fallout 3 because just anecdotally, I know that we've mentioned this or I've mentioned this in a few episodes. I think I mentioned this in the episode with Christopher Jason Bell. I know I've mentioned this another time as well. Maybe actually in the Skyrim episode with Sam Tet because it's also, Fallout 3 and Oblivion and Skyrim, they feel very similar. I think it's the same similar team or developers that made those games. So there's a very similar kind of ethos of the game where you're this kind of it's you can be first person or third person. You can do the kind of over the shoulder like third person view. And I know that Fallout 3 is very different. Like Fallout 3 and the ones afterwards are very different from Fallout and Fallout 2, which are more, I think, like isometric kind of games with a totally different scope. Um, but Fallout 3, the thing that I say that I we mentioned before in the podcast is that it's one of those games that certainly for me when I was younger, uh, did change just the way that I looked at the world, I think, in certain ways. And again, not conceptually. I didn't think the world was this nuclear apocalypse, right? So even that is like I'm not talking about it changed the way I see the world in the way that we usually mean that. It means that I changed the way I felt in the world, I think, because looking at space in that game is just totally, I think it was maybe one of the first games that I played where you're in these just totally abandoned, desolate places. And so, I don't know, as a kid, you go to, you see some kind of empty lot and it feels like it has some kind of, and I don't mean that I was like thinking of a backstory for it, right? But it feels like it has some kind of history that precedes my encounter with it, which is what partly I think what Fallout 3 is about, right? So the setup of the game is that you're this character who has lived in this underground vault because there's been this kind of nuclear war, and everything's kind of frozen in like 1950s Americana, right? So you're in the future. I forget exactly what year it's supposed to be when you go back up to the, terrestrial Earth or whatever from being in an underground vault. But everything is like frozen in like a bombed out 1950s sort of aesthetic. But as Boulter notes, the uniquely weird thing that happens is that the game kind of begins with your character being born. So you're literally born, and then the doctor who delivers you is your father. Which I mean, we've talked a lot about avatars, we've talked a lot about, identification, but to mimetically, represent the birth of your character, and then you have to, then you name your character. There's even, I think, moments where you crawl around as a baby and you have to do things as the character, and you have this kind of development cycle of the character. And of course, it's accelerated, it's kind of truncated, it's pretty quick. It's not like you play hours as a baby, which would be kind of interesting, but that, that does, I think, do something that maybe falls away for a lot of players in the game, but it's something that you could think about your kind of experience playing the game, especially once you get back up to the or get up for the first time and open the vault and then by the way, that is one of those moments of wonder, right? You slowly open the vault door and there's this light flooding in on this like gray burnt out wasteland. I know that the developers too were really influenced by The Road by Cormac McCarthy, so it is totally this post-apocalyptic, you're in this just total, yeah, everything is bombed out. Things are irradiated, as we've mentioned recently, right? There's just there are raiders. There are these kind of lawless and amoral or immoral people who are just trying to gather, resources and survive. But there are also these kind of like mutant scorpions and ants and things like that that will just come up and kill you essentially. Um, and so the way of being in space in the game, there are just like with Skyrim, right? There is a kind of arc that you can take. There's a whole political arc of the game. There's a all these different figures who are vying for power, and you can sort of take different decisions within it. So there is kind of like it's one of those games that has kind of like a good and bad meter sort of thing, right? Um, but you can also just kind of go from place to place, and I think this is what's just wonderful about the game. You can treat it as a sort of um, again, completionist here. I can treat it as a place where I try to find every place on the map, right? And that means something different from what it means in Elden Ring, for example, right? I mean, uh, because the way you interact with space in these games as like a first person character, you can, go through people's drawers in their houses and you can get a sundress and stuff like that. You get these like 1950s accoutrements of domestic life, and then you find these, there are all these odd kind of Easter eggs to the game as well. but I think the whole, I guess the whole sort of point about being in a future space, or being in this kind of space that's supposed to be, or conceivably would be like after the human, right? I mean, nuclear war where everyone is pretty much wiped out. Somehow these people have survived and they're coming back into, a space which is intact but is destroyed, right? So it's kind of both things at once. I mean, this is a big, I mean, I see this as being a big, or this reading is largely inspired by Blancho's writing on the disaster, which Boulter has a whole other book about, the disaster is this kind of paradoxical thing which has already happened, but also like doesn't ever happen. There's a strange temporality to it. In the game itself, I mean, you pointed out nicely how maybe it's easier to be post-human or to be robotic or whatever in a game because it's just hard to represent. And I would agree. I think it's just easier to maybe represent stuff being destroyed than it is to represent like if this whole world in Fallout was like all the buildings were intact and there were people all over them. I think we mentioned this with Silent Hill as well. Like it's easier to just have an abandoned crappy apartment than it is to have the apartment like running as normal, you know? Um,
Although minimalist modernism is somewhat easy to do, it's so geometric, and maybe that if you look at a game like
sure,
Control, which is like the sort of brutalist architecture and this like very, very slick, almost antiseptic design, like that game was hailed for its design, but of course, like in a way, it again is sort of using the medium really well. Like it would be much harder maybe to do a really, really immersive like Victorian house, although
sure.
it's been done, but it's just you need a lot more unique assets for that.
Yeah, yeah.
You need to have like four kinds of spoons at least. But sorry, I cut you off.
No, that's great. I mean, yeah, no, I think that's right because I think also, the design of what is there in Fallout would be kind of, a lot more minimal for the most part, I think. But I think my point is that, even if it's true that it's just simply easier to represent this, I think that it also gives us the uniquely interpretable opportunity of thinking about what it is to come back to these spaces that are like no longer for us, or no longer, no longer intact in the way that they function. And even the human who lives on after a disaster is something else than the regular human, right? I mean, I think this is uh I won't get into it. This is also something that Blanchot is thinking about in his book as well, right? So like to live on after a disaster is to be completely changed in the way that you are as a subject, right?
Hmm.
But also at the same time, that was also already true. I mean, this is the classic, I guess, like where it's kind of a deconstructionist point, right? Where it's like this was already kind of the case, right? So the disaster doesn't necessarily, uh, I mean, it's a tricky theoretical question, but the disaster doesn't necessarily need to happen in this literal sense for us to see that after the disaster, after this, whatever that might mean, we are something else than just the regular human, capital S subject that we purport to be, or that we've been taught we are, or whatever. And so games, especially games where this is the theme, uh, help us kind of see that.
Yeah, that's great. I like that you called attention to the birth scene. One thing that's really good that Bolter's great at in this book is taking these moments from very classic, he calls them canonical games, which is totally right. BioShock, Fallout 3, Half-Life 2, Metal Gear Solid, um, and showing how they're not just really good test cases for analyzing concepts, but actually exemplary of entire like medium level sort of issues or questions. Um, and so to just give two examples, like he points out that the opening of Fallout where you start as a baby I'm pretty sure, unless I'm misremembering, I think he says somewhere that this is in a way true of all games. Like all games were basically a baby because we have to be introduced into this brand new world with no sense of who we are, no sense of what the world even is, and we have to sort of learn how to live in this world, and how to be a person. Um, Similarly, he points out, actually, before I get to the second example, I'm sorry, I have to stop for a second. This is becoming a theme. I don't have a siren right now, but can you hear that?
No,
Um,
but I just had a car like horn going off right outside
okay.
the
I
window.
think they've scrambled the jets out here. We have I'm hearing just a lot of aircraft flying overhead. It reminds me of this in in the trailers for Metal Gear Solid 2. We'll talk about this next week, I'm sure. But like in the trailers for Metal Gear Solid 2, they show Solid Snake battling a Harrier jet on the George Washington Bridge in New York. And for various reasons, some of them that are actually really interesting, that doesn't happen in the game.
Hmm.
But it was like it's so perverse to have like this insane like Michael Bay set piece of battling a man battling a fighter jet on
Yeah.
a major commuter commuter bridge. Just not be in the product, like in any form whatsoever. You do battle a Harrier jet, but it's in a completely different, much more
Hmm.
prosaic as far as video games go, setting.
Yeah.
Okay, the Jets have stopped. If they start again,
Well, one
I'll
thing I'll just say too, just picking up on what you said, as Boulter says, I guess just to add in kind of a representative quote, he says that all tutorial sessions in games are allegories of the gamer-game relationship.
yeah.
Um, And so, I think we like to do this. This is something that we do as like thinkers and people who are thinking about whether it's games or literature, but this kind of mirroring of the form and content and especially in an experiential sense, I think is something really nice that Boulter points out here.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I think we should have a separate discussion. No, I don't think today is the time, but from my work that I'm really interested in that act of mirroring form and content and what's really at stake when we do that as critics or as thinkers. It's something it's become very reflexive in critical writing, like even popular critical writing, even to the point where I'm pretty sure ChatGPT knows how to do it. So like ChatGPT, like will like I see this in Chat GPT slop that comes across my desk. It'll do stuff like, it'll say the narrative it'll root a narrative or formal concern back to something that's happening in the story, which is basically like a very simple version of this gesture, But Bolter is, of course, like he's so sophisticated and careful in how he deploys it. It really works when he does it. I was just going to say quickly, like the birth, sort of the coming into the world, being born thing has another connection back to what I was talking about earlier with the idea of convenience, representational convenience. Let's call it the representational convenience of the posthuman or something, or the prehuman. Um, and this is something that Boulter himself writes a good deal about, like really intelligently. But he talks about the sort of amnesia of certain protagonists, the way in which protagonists in games may be sort of traumatized by the loss of their past. And once again, it's a case where like trauma, or displacement actually creates a kind of harmony or happiness on the part of the player avatar relationship. Brendan Chung, the designer Brendan Chung, I hope I'm getting the name right. He has a game called 30 Flights of Loving from like 2013. It's this like really weird little cinematic game that actually experiments with jump cuts and quick cuts that you're playing through. So like it's incredibly disorienting. It's like such a common technique in film, but you'll be walking through a space and then it'll actually jump cut to you walking through a different space or walking through that space in the future. It's anyone who's interested in, especially in like cinematic language and form, and like how truly surreal it is if you experience it as like phenomenologically, should check out this game. But in the developer notes, he has this cool way of doing developer notes or designer notes where like you can explore the game and sort of removed from the pressures of the actual campaign, as it were, even though the game is about 5 minutes or 15 minutes long, and just sort of explore the spaces for his commentary. He has this one uh, note where he just talks about how amnesia is a popular trope in games precisely because it syncs what we know with what the character knows. So there doesn't need to be, again, that discrepancy between like, Joel has a history, he knows all kind of stuff, but we actually don't, right? And so we're learning about it belatedly. This is particularly pronounced in The Last of Us Part 2 because like what the characters know is actually really important and constitutes a genuine plot twist. But that's also a weird paradox because we are the character and yet we don't know what they know. And in fact, the story relies on us not knowing what they know, even though we're controlling their bodies. So amnesia is another case of like trauma as convenience, or displacement, dislocation, paradox as actually something harmonious. It's like the harmony or like the easiness of paradox or something. Um, Anyway, that's a side note. I wanted to also flag another really beautiful moment in the book where Boulter points to the beginning of Half-Life 2, where you are thrust sort of in medias res, like actually the character sort of teleports like from a sort of state of suspended animation into a train arriving at a totalitarian city. And the game, like there's announcers, it's one of the best openings event of all time in a video game. And there's like a really cool sort of environmental storytelling effects and ways in which the game is like sort of demonstrating to you just by showing rather than telling, like how authoritarian and restrictive and repressive this state and regime are. And Boulter says, like, but of course, this is the case for basically all single player games. Like, all single player games, we're thrust into a world where they have to teach us the rules, and the rules are much more repressive than the rules of everyday reality. Actually, you know, Boulter also, I think, quite cogently takes issue with the Zizek claim that games are about breaking taboos and sort of games are about breaking from repression. Because in many ways, games are far more repressive than life. Like you can't open most doors in a game. You can't sit down on things. You can't take a nap or eat a snack in a game in many cases. Even though you can jump, it's like you're given like two de-repressive capabilities, right? You can shoot people and you can jump 20 feet in the air. But everything else that would make life interesting or exciting is stripped away or banned by law. So Bolter's point is just that like all games are totalitarian in that sense, or all single player games at least, or most games. And you're always being inducted and in some ways indoctrinated into repressive rule systems. Of course, those repressive rule systems are also the occasion for pleasure and play. Like the games are more fun because they're limited. We talk about this all the time on this podcast, but it's just another very um, just really really lovely use of that move, right? Of taking this specific fictional situation or scenario and abstracting it into a general framework for understanding the medium.
Yeah, I would just say too, just quickly, I mean, this is why he calls games melancholic, right? Like, or the experience of playing games is melancholic. I think he says the gaming experience is defined by its offer of a limited suspension of the real, right? So anything that we would think, I mean, I think games can be certainly liberatory, but they're not going to be liberatory because they represent some other world, right? They're going to be liberatory for the way that we can understand our world via them, or that we can experience something, hopefully, in this kind of like micro pre-human sense rather than a larger conceptual sense. I don't know. That's at least where I come out on it. Like I totally think that, I mean, again, to say it again, like what is important to identify with or to identify about games, I guess, is not who it is or, what things are happening, but more on a much smaller level, like what's being highlighted about the pre-human, right? So like even if we have a robot who's, doing something that's really beautiful, it's the beautiful thing that's important, or the thing that is really precise that's important, not the fact that it's a robot doing it or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like we should start wrapping up. But is it okay if I say I kind of I've had like multiple monologues here, but I want to like sort of explain one or sort of go off on one more thing that I thought was really provocative. And in a way, this is like uh um, I guess it's something that I started thinking about towards the end of the Metal Gear chapter. It's really just uh, in the sort of whatever to cut to the chase. I think this book was published in 2015, and at the time, Metal Gear Solid 4 was like I guess Peace Walker had come out, but Metal Gear Solid 4 was the last like mainline entry in the series. But Metal Gear Solid 5 comes out in 2015 also. And that game does sort of has one element of that game like really interestingly complicates, but also just intensifies one of Boulter's basic points. And so it's like I sort of like, you know, I I'm so curious as to what Bolter would say or would have said about Metal Gear Solid 5. Maybe he would have just pointed at it and said nothing and been like, whatever QED. Like this game is just the perfect instantiation of what I'm talking about. But um, he's talking about cloning. And Metal Gear is a series. Ultimately, it's very convoluted. The narrative is so out of control, but ultimately centers on this super soldier named Big Boss and his sons who are clones of him. And so they uh, um, each one follows. It begins as a series about Solid Snake, but ultimately becomes uh, essentially equally a series about Big Boss. There are three games ostensibly starring Big Boss and three games starring Solid Snake. And Bolter has this very simple but very astute point that, like, at the end of Metal Gear Solid 4, where you've played as Snake for three of the games, Metal Gear Solid 1, 2, and 4, and Big Boss for one of them, Metal Gear Solid 3, you're actually, like, although Snake himself is a genetic clone of Big Boss, like, I feel like I'm mangling or simplifying his point, but it's that the player themselves is sort of occupying a kind of clone relationship to these characters, or that really they're all the same, which is practically speaking true, right? Like actually the character model of Big Boss in Metal Gear Solid 3 both behaves and looks exactly like the character model of Snake in Metal Gear Solid 2. Those are both for the PS2 generation, so they're just using the same assets basically. Um, and like the player's experience manipulating Big Boss and controlling him as an avatar is perfectly continuous with their experience of controlling Snake as an avatar. They just do the same things, they're voiced by the same person, they have the same name. Um, he points out really interestingly that at the end of Metal Gear Solid 4, there's this weird, this very, very over the top but satisfying boss fight with your twin Liquid Snake, where the interface and music switch through the various iterations of the series. So, like, you start out the boss fight in Metal Gear Solid 1, and the health bars look like Metal Gear Solid 1, the names look like Metal Gear Solid 1 from 1998, and the music is the boss theme from that game, and then you get the combat theme from two, and etc. The Bolter's point, which is really interesting, is that the game ends. You finish the final sequence of the fight um, in Metal Gear Solid 3, which is the one where you play as Big Boss. So actually, as you finish like your last moments as Snake in this series, your UI is telling you that you're actually Big Boss, which is just a really interesting wrinkle, partly as a function of this kind of like fan servicey synthesizing of the different interfaces and styles of the games. But it's something that seems to illustrate the fact, like the truth that these are all just the same person. They're all clones, not like genetic clones, but just like more like existential clones or something. Um, okay, I do feel like I did a disservice to Bolter's like very sophisticated reading, but I'm only presenting this as context because in Metal Gear Solid 5, this is a huge spoiler. So anyone who plans to play that game or doesn't want it spoiled should stop listening. Um, Metal Gear Solid 5, there's this insane plot twist. So the game begins with you as Big Boss, and you've recovered from an assassination attempt. And you're like horribly scarred, and you're like missing an arm, and your face is disfigured. And early on, a doctor comes out, and when you're in the hospital, and says, hey, we need to change your face so that you can evade, further attempts on your life. And then you're actually taken to a character creator. So Bolter himself writes very perceptively about the difference between games where you can select and customize your avatar's appearance and games where you can't. Metal Gear is like the antithesis to a series where you'd ever customize your avatar, and yet there's this strange sort of incongruous moment where we're given a choice to sculpt a new face. But then the doctor, before he can perform the facial surgery, is killed. So you never get your facial surgery done. So it's like, what was the point of that interface, right? Um, However, at the very end of the game, and this is a spoiler, you learn that you're not actually Big Boss. You're one of his just lieutenants who was in the helicopter with him that exploded. and they surgically modified you to look like Big Boss. So you become a retroactive clone of Big Boss. You're his body double, essentially. So this whole time you've been playing the game, you think the player thinks they're playing as Big Boss. They're actually playing as some rando. And they're playing as a rando who has the face that you designed, which is already really perverse and doesn't make any sense because the face you're designing is your new face that's going to help you evade assassination in the future. But in the end of the game, there's a reveal as you look in the mirror and it shows that face. And the understanding is that that's the face that you designed as your future face is actually your real face, i.e., your past face, before you got Big Boss's face grafted onto you. So there's a kind of temporal paradox or a simple contradiction at work here. That is a question for another day, and we can talk about that when we talk about the series. What's really striking here is just actually what it's doing is um, positioning you, the player, as now being Big Boss. Like, essentially, this guy who we've been playing as is just some rando, right? Like the player. And you might even imagine a case where the player tries to design an avatar that looks like them precisely for some kind of physical identification. And so the game is literalizing on the diegetic level. Like all this time, you, player, who holds the controller now, you actually are Big Boss because you've sort of in performing his actions and completing this game, you've made his legend a reality, you know. Um, and so the player actually is the player character, but also the player is interpolated into the game as a literal clone of Big Boss, but not one of the kids, not Snake or Liquid Snake, but actually as an even more cloney clone, like a clone that ha is exactly the same age and exists simultaneously with Big Boss as his literal double. Snake is 30 years younger, so Snake is always gonna, you meet young Liquid Snake in Metal Gear 5, and he's like a little punk kid. Um, and so this this moment, like this incredibly confusing sort of masterstroke of the plot, like is just a kind of again like a perfect enactment or capstone to like Boulter's own theory of like the sort of clone-like relationship of identity and difference that we're constantly occupying. And he emphasizes in the book like the uncanniness of that relationship and the uncanniness of that sort of clone model. You know, so maybe I'm just saying like, yeah, Bolter, hit us up. Like we want to know what you think about Metal Gear Solid 5. It's crazy how prescient this book is when you read it in the context of the final game of that series.
Yeah, and I mean, you said interpolation. He talks about this in the book too, right? I mean, and I think that maybe we can think about interpolation as, I mean, certainly an alternative to identification, right? I mean, if you and that's a different, like a repetition with a difference then. If you are this character because you've been performing his actions rather than because you look like him, like that's clearly not the reason that you are him. You are him because you have become him, right? This is also a question that I think we've seen uh in our discussion of Bennett Sims as well, right? I mean, I think he's interested in this way of um, you know, a kind of unwitting repetition or even like a so overdetermined repetition that it can't simply be a repetition becoming an identity, right? Or becoming interpolated into a new maybe subject position that points out something about the very possibility of identifying with another person in the first place. So
Yeah.
I think that's a really nice connection, maybe a good moment for us to end on here, unless you have any.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we should wrap here. You know, circling back to our discussion of the posthuman, I mentioned this story by Samuel Beckett. It's actually an unfinished manuscript that was never published, but an author named Michael Coffey writes really suggestively about it in a book called Samuel Beckett is Closed.
Mhm.
Um, this is the unfinished manuscript, failed manuscript called Long Observation of the Ray, where again Beckett was trying to sort of shift the parameters of narrative towards something completely non-human, where the protagonist, so to speak, of the story, or even like the action of the story is just the movement and emanation of light in a closed chamber. Um, and to that I say, Brian, like if we want to be post-human too, we got to keep that magic ray lit.
Absolutely. Thank you.
See ya.